When I was in my early 20s, I moved out of my parents' house with my brother, and with a mutual friend, we rented our own 2-story house. It was an older style house with very high ceilings and ornate decorative handrails and doorknobs. It wasn't until after we moved in that we learned at one point the house used to be a funeral home, and out in the detached garage was where the bodies used to be stored and prepared for display. I guess it made sense, since there was a small cemetery just behind the house, though most of the tombs had been mostly swallowed up by the tall grass. We were big into those paranormal-type ghost hunting shows, so on one of the first nights we were living there, we went outside and tried capturing white noise on our phones. We'd ask questions to the empty air, and play back the recording to see if we caught anything. We were disappointed but not surprised when, after half an hour or so, we gave up after not uncovering anything even remotely creepy. Looking back, I think we succeeded in getting something's attention, however. It started slow. Our friend had chronic back problems, so instead of sleeping upstairs, he'd sleep on the couch on the ground floor. He would every so often report hearing footsteps or muttering voices coming from the far side of the house. Specifically, the voice was of a woman talking in a kind of happy sing-song voice, like she was talking playfully with a small child. After a while, all three of us would begin to feel very uncomfortable downstairs at night. We felt as though something were peering in at us from the darkness outside, and we covered all the windows with sheets. Our friend was unhappy sleeping on the ground floor on his own, but neither of us were willing to sleep downstairs, and he didn't want to have to suffer climbing the stairs twice every day. One night, we awoke to screaming from downstairs, and we ran down to the living room to discover our friend staring wide-eyed up at the ceiling and clutching his blanket like he was trying to tear it in two. He said he'd awoken to the sound of ragged, labored breathing from the corner of the room, and when he called out, something had shifted in the darkness across from the couch. We helped him climb the stairs, and he spent that night on the second floor with us. I personally believe I had the two most vivid, alarming experiences, even though I didn't tell my roommates about them at the time. Once, when I was home alone, I was cleaning my bedroom and singing along to my tunes. It was broad daylight out, and I didn't feel uneasy or nervous at all. Everything seemed normal. I turned round to grab something and exit my room when I froze. Someone had just exited my room. I caught a glimpse of a tall figure with long, dark hair walking out the door and turning sideways to walk down the hall. Most of the memory is a blur, but one thing I distinctly remember was seeing feathers hanging from the back of the figure's head, amongst the hair. I shot out of my room and tore after the figure and ran down the stairs, but there was no one there. I was completely alone in the house. My second experience happened the day we finally moved out. We'd been living in the house for well over a year at that point. My brother and friend had since moved everything out, and I was alone sweeping the kitchen area. From across the house, I heard a soft thud, like a pile of towels had fallen over onto the floor. It made me pause because I knew there was practically nothing left in the house that could have tipped over. I'm not sure why I decided to do it, but I began speaking aloud to the empty house around me. "We're leaving the house now, so we won't be bothering you anymore. If you have anything to say to me, now's the time." I waited a few seconds but did not get any kind of response. I tried again. "If you hear me, give me a response." I knocked hard on the counter 3 times, and almost immediately, from somewhere down in the basement, I heard the 3 knocks mimicking my own in the same rhythm. Well, I dropped the broom and Powell walked right out the front door. I shut it, locked it, and waited on the front steps until my brother got back to pick me up. I told him the cleaning was done and that we could leave. I'm never even going to pretend to mess with the supernatural ever again.
In 2014, I was visiting my niece at my brother's place. He had stepped out for a moment, I don't remember why, so I was chatting with my sister-in-law as she rocked the baby to sleep in the living room. Deciding to check on my other niece in the other room, I stood up and walked down the hall to peek into her room. The older niece, we'll call her Amy, was a toddler and was sitting on the floor of her room playing with random toys and babbling to herself. I was about to return to the living room when something caught my eye. The rocking chair by the baby's crib was gently swaying back and forth. I watched it for a moment, assuming Amy had just climbed down off it and would eventually stop. But it didn't. In fact, the motion of the swaying was all wrong. Each rock was very slow and steady, not light and quick, as if someone were seated upon it. I watched for a few more minutes, but the swaying continued without slowing down. I poked my head inside and Amy greeted me without looking up from her toys. Then, she said something that made my breath catch in my throat.
Jesus says hi.
I managed an awkward response, asking what she meant. She continued.
Jesus is right there. He says he loves you.
My family isn't religious at all, and I had no idea how to respond to her friendly declaration. I heard the floor creak, and suddenly the rocking chair stopped swaying, as if someone seated in the chair had paused. I backed out of the room and staggered back to the kitchen, more shaken than afraid. My sister-in-law must have seen the look on my face and asked, "What is it?" I looked back at her and nervously asked, "Have you noticed anything strange happening with Amy?" She didn't even hesitate. "All the time. Why? What did you see?" I told her about what I had just experienced, and she shot up from her chair. "Did you record it?" was her first question to me. She handed me the baby as I muttered a confused no and walked past me down the hall. I didn't follow, but heard her speaking to Amy. "Sweetie, who are you talking to?"
Jesus, Mommy. He says he loves you.
She poked her head back out of the room and looked down the hall at me. "Was that chair moving?" she asked. I nodded. "Oh, yeah. This has happened before." She took out her phone to record the inside of the bedroom. When my brother got home, I handed him the baby and left. I didn't talk to him about it. I didn't want to be involved.
Eight years ago, when I was about 10 years old, my family relocated to a small, single-story house with the intention of renovating and flipping it. It was in a heavy industrial-type area and wasn't originally designed to be a house. My parents converted the largest office into the master bedroom because it had a bathroom attached to it. My siblings shared another room on the outer perimeter of the house, but I got stuck in a smaller room in the center of the house, so there were no windows. When I first walked into the small, isolated chamber I would be sleeping in, I immediately got the sense like I wasn't allowed in there. It was as though I was breaking some kind of unspoken rule being in there, and I couldn't shake it. I tried to distract myself by setting up my furniture and toys and trying to personalize the room and make it feel more welcoming, but the feeling just continued to strengthen. It was like I was vandalizing someone else's property. My door was open as I was finishing up, and at that moment I happened to be alone in the house. I heard the frantic scurrying of paws across the linoleum in the kitchen up the hall, the quick tapping of nails on the floor echoing as your pet comes towards you. I smiled and ran out into the hall, because I assumed our dogs had arrived. The idea had been to keep them at our friend's place until we had put up a fence in the backyard, but apparently the plans had changed. I caught sight of a shadow taking the corner and disappearing towards the main entrance, and I called out to my dog. But then the sound stopped, and all I could hear was a tense silence. I took the corner, but my dog wasn't anywhere in sight, and there hadn't been the sound of any door closing whatsoever. I went outside and asked my parents where the dogs were, and they gave me a quick reminder that the dogs wouldn't be coming for another few days. My tiny 10-year-old brain couldn't process what had just happened, but instead of trying to explain what I had seen, I just kept my mouth shut. I spent the night in my siblings' room, half convinced that there was an animal running loose somewhere in the house. Fast forward about 3 months or so. The house was coming together nicely, and I was feeling much more comfortable in my bedroom. The strange, unwelcome feeling had subsided, and I was enjoying my cavern of privacy. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering in my room. I sat up and paused, half convinced that I had heard my own name being spoken from across the room in the dark. I flipped on my light to reveal everything appearing totally normal. I turned the light back off and settled back into bed, and would have dismissed this altogether if not for what happened next. My younger sister started screaming from her room that something was calling her name from near the window. I followed my parents down the hall to her room, where she was literally shaking in fear, stating that something had been taunting her, trying to get her to leave her room and head to the small pond in the backyard. She said that she had seen it looking at her through the window. My father turned on the porch light and went out to the back to put her mind at ease, and later came back in and said that he hadn't seen anything. A few years later, after we had long since left the house, he admitted that there had been something out by the pond, an animal of some kind that he assumed to be a bobcat. Even though he hadn't seen it, he got the feeling of danger from it and had walked back inside. My sister would later report that she couldn't sleep for the rest of the night because something with red eyes was stalking around the backyard, looking towards her window every few minutes. Now things start to get weirder. The first two occurrences could be dismissed as imagination, paranoia, or nightmares, but even my parents began to feel uneasy after what happened next, though they didn't show it at the time. It was the middle of the day and my sister and I were watching TV in the living room reception area when we heard thudding coming from across the roof. We lost our minds in fear, because the footfalls were so heavy. We were convinced that a bear or something had to be on the roof. We could hear the supports in the ceiling straining under the weight. We hid behind the couch, which in retrospect was dumb. Heading to the basement probably would have been the safer option if something was about to fall through the roof. When my parents got home, we didn't have to say anything because the footsteps hadn't stopped. My dad grabbed his rusty old pitchfork and went outside, ready to prod something down off the roof, which we had assumed was a dog of some kind. I should point out that our dogs weren't there on that particular day, but I don't quite remember why. The only way up onto the roof was this dead tree alongside the opposite wall of the house, and my dad climbed up it no problem. But when he reached the roof, there was nothing up there. Well, nothing except for a toy horse that I had lost the first week we had moved in, and my sister's doll that she had brought home that day. Even when my dad stomped as hard as he could across the roof, the noise wasn't as loud as what we had all heard before. My parents had the tree cut down that weekend. There were a few instances after that where the TV would misbehave and turn off by itself during the night, but nothing of real concern until that summer. The housework was finished, and we were getting ready to move out, as a buyer had already been found. I was playing hide and seek with my siblings and had chosen this chest in the back room as the best place to lay low. There were a whole bunch of coats and boots and random things in there, and when I climbed in and burrowed amongst the coats, I felt my leg bump up against someone else. My younger sister seemed to have had the same idea and was already hiding in there. I didn't want to give us away, so I didn't say anything, but instead just carefully shut the lid. There was just enough room for both of us in there, and we curled up close together. I'm not sure how long we were in there for. I heard my older sister walk through the room, looking for us a couple of times, and after a few minutes of silence, I poked my head through the coats and cracked the lid on the chest to get some air. Through the door to the next room, I could see my sisters looking around the family room for me. Both of my sisters. I screamed and shot up so fast that I smacked my head against the chest lid and made to scramble out of there. As I was doing this, something grabbed my leg. It wasn't a firm, "you're not going anywhere" type of grab, but it was more of a confirmation like, yeah, I was here the whole time. The whole chest pitched forward and I scrambled out, wailing like a siren and bawling my eyes out. When my sisters saw me, they began panicking, asking why I was so bruised up. I went into the bathroom and discovered that I had scratches and bruises all up and down my arms, legs, and neck. They weren't so bad that I was bleeding or anything, but I did look like I had let something poke at me with thumbtacks for a while. My parents were convinced that my siblings had attacked me, even after I told them that I had been in the trunk. We moved away that summer. Looking back, it's funny how quickly abnormal things like that become totally irrelevant as you get a change of scenery and life goes on. My family and I still remember those events but rarely speak of them. Not because we're afraid, just because we don't see much point to it. I wonder if that's how most people adapt after experiencing something they couldn't explain. Dismissive and indifferent, like it may as well have never happened.